we're back this afternoon, and rather than a speaker, because we know what happens after lunch, rather than a speaker, we're going to have a panel discussion. We're going to have a panel discussion. This panel discussion is the Roundtable speakers from this morning. I'd like to ask them all to come on up and take their seats. If you would, please, Sandy and Duane and Gwynne and John, please come on up and take your seats. This session is sponsored by the NASA Office of Education. Isn't that nice? I guess the deal went through faster than I thought it would. I just checked CNN to see if we were back open yet. Maybe not. Everyone up here has been introduced except Sandy. So I'd like to say just a couple of words about Dr. Sandra Magnus, who is a close colleague of mine. I had the great opportunity to work with her on a number of different flights. Currently, she is the executive director of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, which, as you probably all know, is the world's largest technical society dedicated to the global aerospace professional, with more than 35,000 members in 79 countries. Dr. Magnus got her degrees in physics, electrical engineering, PhD in material science, so she could probably tell us how to build those transistors, right? Maybe she'll give us that. And it's been in space a number of different times, including 4.5 months on the International Space Station and a number of shuttle flights. And I got to say, you know, people frequently ask me in my consulting role, who would be a good astronaut for us to hire for a management position in our company? And I tell you, there are a lot of really great astronauts that have done really great things, but there are not a lot of them that have demonstrated their management potential the way Sandy has. And the leadership and organizational skills that she has gone beyond what it merely takes to fly in space, to be able to organize and manage a great enterprise like the AIAA. So,
thank you, Wayne.
Sandy.
Thank you very much. That's sort of a big buildup, so hopefully I won't let you guys down today. I'm really excited to be here. We have a great panel, and I just want to spend a moment to comment that Bill Gerstenmaier was also scheduled, as you know, to be on this panel. Unfortunately, we know why he cannot. He really wanted to be here. He did send some comments to me in one of his forays into email that I think he was allowed. Gwen mentioned they're allowed 4 times a day on email, so he took one of those moments to sneak me some material that he would like to be presented in his stead. The way the panel is set up this afternoon is each speaker will have a 4-minute presentation, and then we would like to open up the panel for discussion and dialogue with you, the audience, and whoever happens to be on the internet. We, you know, the purpose of a panel is to, I think, engage in dialogue and get everybody involved in the topic, and perhaps we can reinforce certain ideas, introduce some new ideas, and explore some uncharted territory. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started, and I'd like to start with some of the comments that Bill sent me over the email, and then we'll just go right down the line and jump right into the question and answers. Bill comments that, of course, the Bell Labs and the ISS are both research facilities, and they have some similarities and they have some differences. You know, at Bell Labs, we heard this morning that the multidisciplinary approach there, the ability to get a lot of scientists and engineers together in one spot to brainstorm was very key to some of the innovation and technology development that they did there. Of course, on ISS, it's a little bit more difficult to get a lot of people on the station at one time. You know, we're up to 6 now, which is great, but it's a little bit different paradigm than Bell Labs. But what the ISS does and what it does provide is a way to do a lot of very interesting, multidisciplinary, very diverse research on the station that expands our knowledge in a lot of different areas. And the results of that research and the community of people who contribute to deciding what that research should be is a very multidisciplinary community. And that crosstalk is going on in a way that's very similar to the Bell Labs, even though the exact way the platform's being used and the exact way that the research is being introduced in the experiment and their results are being dispersed is very different. But that's a very similar paradigm there. Bell Labs is focused on quality of service and reliability. ISS is doing the same thing. I'm sure you're well aware of all of the technology demonstration and development that's going on the space station. For example, I can speak from personal experience. We put the water regeneration system into the station, and it's been working ever since, and we're learning a lot about how to do water recycling and closed life support systems for moving on to Mars, as Gwen mentioned earlier today. So there's a lot of great technology demonstration going on this space station. And we have to continue to look for creative ways to use the ISS. It's this wonderful platform up there. There are ways we're using it that are great. There are ways we're trying to use it. Duane mentioned this morning about some of the industry interest in doing research on station. What other kind of tools do we need to put up on the station to not only perform the experiments, but perhaps perform some of the analysis and some of the research we need to do and analysis that on station you can then turn these experiments around a lot faster. So what other kinds of capabilities can we add to station to make it an even better, more useful platform? And then, of course, we don't know what we don't know. And that's why we have a platform in that unique microgravity environment. And we're going to learn new things, and they're going to be disruptive. And disruptive is not necessarily a negative term or a negative idea. There are people who are trying to look for unique ways to use the environment. There's a group that's sending up an experiment to do 3D printing in space. You know, what kind of additive manufacturing techniques are applicable into microgravity. And that could be a really interesting, disruptive demonstration of technology that will not only change how we approach spaceflight and working and living in space and building things in space, but will have applications here terrestrially. So the station is a wonderful platform for innovation. These are certainly some ways that we have been using the station. These are some ways we can continue to grow the capability of the space station. And like I said, if we don't know what we don't know, and that's very exciting because that's what exploration is all about. So we don't even know what we're going to learn. So I will stop there, and I will hand over to Duane.
Thanks, Sandy. So I think in the 4 or 5 minutes that I have, I guess a couple of things I'd like to do is maybe try to capitalize on some of the points I made earlier this morning and maybe fill in a little bit. I really wish that Bill were here. We have been working very closely with Mr. Gerstenmaier and all of his staff to really identify what it is that we can do to not only help cases be successful, but more importantly, help the ISS sort of meet that extension goal. He has told us on a number of occasions that what he really wants to see cases do is to do the things that NASA can't. He actually wants to see us step out a little further on the ledge with respect to taking on risks and entertaining opportunities for ISS utilization that they simply just can't contemplate. And in fact, I think in one informal discussion, he may have even said, we kind of expect for you to fail a couple of times or make mistakes so that you're at least opening up the envelope. So with that, I think what I see interesting in ISS can also be a little bit detrimental to it, and that is if you look at a laboratory, I won't say a national laboratory, if you look at a laboratory on the ground, typically these laboratories are built to very specific and exact specifications. If you're, again, I mentioned pharmaceutical companies, if you're in the business of building, of creating drugs that you want to sell to the market, your lab is going to be set up to do just that very purpose. Yet when we look at ISS, and Sandy probably knows this firsthand, it has a multitude of capabilities. It's extremely diverse. It not only can support life sciences research and biotechnology development, it also has platforms and facilities to support material sciences, physical sciences. The external environment is a wonderful platform because of its uniqueness to geosynchronous orbit and polar orbits for conducting remote sensing and Earth observations that you really can't do probably from those orbits. And in addition to that, it provides a wonderful platform for technology development and demonstration or enhancing TRL levels that are absolutely necessary for anyone who is working in the commercial satellite industry. If you think about it, there is a tremendous investment in developing a piece of hardware, whether it's optics or sensors or communications device or what have you, that you want to launch into a geosynchronous orbit and have produce data from you from minute one. You obviously need reliability and dependability, and you need to be rest assured that those functions are going to occur post-launch, because they're really hard to recover. If you think about the International Space Station, thanks to SpaceX and Orbital, it's extremely accessible. You can actually do subsystem and system development, checkout, and testing on a repeated model. You can access your experiment, you can collect data from it, you can actually bring it back home and tweak it and retest it again. And that's something that you really can't do, or that really supplements with respect to that potential opportunity. So the challenge we have, again, as I mentioned this morning, is what are the unique capabilities that the ISS provides? And I would argue that there are a multitude of them, and I just listed a few. But what we really need to do is now align that very closely with what are, at least for our mission, what are the needs that are in the terrestrial marketplace. It's one thing to say we have a platform that's extremely beneficial and capable of doing X, but if there's nobody who's really interested in buying a product that results in that in Y, then really we're not able to connect the dots. So some of the things that we need to do as we move forward are identify the capabilities and do the real true-to-ground market analyses to identify the needs. And then, quite clearly, you'll see some synergies and parallels occur, but there's also going to be some hurdles or constraints that you'll need to identify and address. And what we are starting to see is that there is a slight technological lag in the equipment that's on station with respect to the type of equipment that's being used in certain markets today for producing products or developing IP. But for us, I think it's our responsibility to identify what they are and then identify what we can do to change that. Sandy alluded to the fact that depending on the area of research that you're interested in or the area of technology that you would like to pursue, there are options for either conducting in situ analysis or actually simply not getting your experiment back, but just the data that you're most interested in. And then finally, an alternative model would be bringing your experiment home for analytical functions that you just simply can't perform on orbit. Every single project or payload or experiment, no matter what you want to call it, is probably going to have a little bit of a difference in what has the best value in those models. But for us to be able to create those models and have that choice is something that we really need to look at. We also need to look at streamlining our processes. And more importantly, we need to look at aligning them more with what a commercial industry looks at with respect to their R&D portfolios. And again, what has typically been a fairly long window with respect to taking a concept and actually conducting the research, generating the data, and performing the analysis when you have your experiment back is quite a lengthy time, and it doesn't really align very well with a lot of the commercial markets that we are emerging into. So there are some opportunities where we can work with NASA to identify what are the issues, what are the constraints, what are the redundancies even in the paperwork and the certification process that can be streamlined or taken away or looked at more from a commercial perspective. I mean, what can we learn from our potential customers that will help us improve our business model? And then finally, our large constraint is cost. And I mentioned, our value proposition is being able to kind of wave the flag that says we're 100% subsidized with respect to our costs for launch and on-orbit logistics, and we are, in fact. However, there are still inherent costs associated with going to a very hard-to-get research laboratory and conducting research on platforms that have a lot of specificity that may not align with what it is that you're researching. And so identifying areas in which we can standardize equipment that's used for research platforms, identifying what the state of the art is with respect to technology and analytical equipment and other research platforms, and translating that as best we can to ISS facilities and racks is absolutely key as we move forward. So I think if we're able to address those three areas and hopefully identify some solutions and then put those solutions into practice, we have a tremendous opportunity for success with respect to ISS utilization.
Thank you very much, Duane. Gwynne?
So I always hate being on a panel when I'm not the first speaker. You end up with not a lot left to say. Duane, you did a good job, actually. So maybe I'll take the discussion in a slightly different place. I think the only reason why we're having this discussion about, or the conversation about ISS utilization is because of politics and because of budgets. Budgets being a reality, politics being unfortunate. So let me just give you some data points. Americans spend $100 billion a year on beer. Beer, not beer and pretzels, not beer in the meal, not beer and wine, not beer and martinis. Beer. $100 billion a year Americans spend on beer. And what have the taxpayers and Congress basically told NASA to do for 16 to 17 billion? Like 16% of what we're willing to spend on beer is, and what are we telling NASA to do? Have a government launch an in-space capsule program that takes us beyond low Earth orbit. Have a commercial program that adequately satisfies the 100 and maybe 80 billion now? I know it's more than 100 billion, the International Space Station. But have frequent commercial access to that asset. Oh, and do technology, and do aircraft development work, and do community outreach, and do. $16 billion. So I really feel like these kinds of forums are the appropriate forums to engage all of us and proselytize folks to spread the word about what we're asking our national treasurer, NASA, to do with $16 billion. Now, I'm not saying that people haven't made mistakes at NASA and with contractors to NASA. I do think it's too expensive getting to ISS. Maybe it was a little bit too expensive to build it. Maybe it's a little bit too expensive to operate, and those should be our challenges going forward, not defend this capability that we all committed to do. So, Duane, you brought up all the good points. We certainly need to make access easier and cheaper and more reliable being key, obviously. You don't want every mission to be like giving birth. You want it to be like hopping on an airplane, and flying to El Paso from LA. I think the paperwork piece is really a critical piece. I hear from scientists, and this is kind of third-party discussion, but you certainly always hear about the bureaucracy associated with getting payloads flown in space. And so clearly we need to work on that as well. But really, I think the big job, the heavy lifting to be done, is to convince our neighbors that investing in space and space technology is the right place to put your money. And I have nothing against beer. I'm actually not a beer drinker. I drink wine and champagne, an occasional martini. But really to help set priorities for the American population, I think it's critically important to refocus the dialogue on that issue as opposed to how can we utilize the ISS so that we can continue to support it. So.
And thank you, Glenn. And finally, John?
I might just pick up on that theme of educating your neighbor. I think that's well put. It seems to me that one challenge, and we were talking about this at lunch too, is that notion of expectations on the public's part of how quickly things happen, how they can happen or should happen without errors or setbacks, how we shouldn't necessarily abandon a pursuit or destroy or blow up a public-private partnership because we hit a setback. And I think that probably everybody in this room knows that that's part and parcel of what you're doing. When you're doing something ambitious and risky, there is going to be failure and there is going to be setbacks. But that kind of notion of does the public understand that? And I gained a very keen appreciation for failure and setbacks in some ways by looking at those long time frames by which world-changing innovations were, ideated and then researched and developed and then manufactured and then even marketed and deployed, and just seeing how long it took and how confusing it was and how misunderstood it often was. And that's not to say that the path forward for all these companies and for ISS isn't delineated and clear, but just that notion of not a kind of rapid, triumphant sort of going from one thing to another without impediment or setback. And it seems to me, and I worry about it, that as a country we've sort of lost patience for that kind of thing. Maybe you guys wouldn't agree, I'm not sure, but that's just my own observation. But I just see it as kind of critical to the innovative process, critical to kind of getting where we want to go. But that notion, maybe in part fueled by this kind of software revolution where we can iterate products so quickly and send them out so fast and make billions of dollars in business and really impact the culture almost instantly, doesn't apply in this domain necessarily because things move slower. But if that's kind of acculturated us to a kind of rapid, innovative process that doesn't hit so many setbacks, or at least hits them so fast, there's that fast fail kind of mentality that again does not apply here. So it's just a kind of point to raise, and I like what you said, Bill Gerstenmaier said to you, that you should be willing to fail. And I told Gwynne at lunch that the fact that they were so transparent when you guys did hit setbacks, I think is such a positive aspect, and to prove that not only did you get past that, but it made you better is just crucial.
Yeah, thank you, John. And while you're writing down any questions that you may have for the panel, and please do that, I'd like to pull on that thread a little bit longer, because I think you really hit a key note there. When you look at what happened at Bell Labs and just the nature of the cycles in our industry, we do need to be able to have the ability to think and plan in long term, and we do need to have the ability to explain why that's important. We all know in this room that we have a rich history of slowly working our way towards these goals, and then things that we're doing along the way have unintended benefits for the world around us that we don't even anticipate before we start along that path. And I think we heard a little bit of that this morning from both Gwynne and Duane. Gwynne, as you talked about evolving your rocket systems and some of the we talked about at lunch a little bit about the technologies that you were developing that you weren't even anticipating. I don't know if you'd like to talk a little bit about that, the unanticipated benefits of this long-term path that we're on.
Sure. So there's no question that where we've ended up as far as the work and the investments that we've put in, we never anticipated doing exactly what we're doing now when we were founded in 2002. I don't think this is pretty pragmatic in engineering, but we didn't anticipate we would be spinning our own domes. Those are the end caps for the tank. We never anticipated we would be building our own heat shield material. By the way, we did that in concert with NASA. We never anticipated we would be building our own LiDAR systems. And I think that came of a need. So we're trying to change the pace. I think it's critically important. Americans have such a short attention span right now. We're trying to increase the pace every year, do better every year. And it's hard to get everybody that's on your team, and I don't mean SpaceX, but I mean all our suppliers and vendors on that same path, because they're helping us and then they're helping a lot of other folks. And so we brought a lot of technology development and manufacturing in-house, and it was completely unintended that we would do that. I mean, I think most business models would say that's the wrong thing to do, actually, that you really want to focus on a few specific things and not diversify. But it's worked for us. I don't know who else it would work for. And as far as the spin-offs, I think we're just at the place where we're developing stuff that I think has applications elsewhere. So I think we're probably a year away from seeing kind of bigger benefits on that particular piece. But I do think it's really important for all of us to think about not just doing as well as we did next year as we did this year, but we have to do better. Look at the electronics industry and the power consumption and the amount of data that gets passed through chips. If they remain static or even improved at half the pace that they did, we wouldn't see anything like what we see today. So we can't allow this industry, this aerospace industry, to think in those long-term schedules. We need, every year, you need to get better, and you should set goals that are, 2x better or 10x better. Actually, what is Moore's law? Is like 10x, 100x, right?
Well, it's 18 months, the memory will double, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of timelines I think we need to think of, and not just do a little bit better than we did last year.
So it's interesting to look at your experience about how you've ended up doing things you didn't anticipate and put that into your paradigm, Duane, of now we have this wonderful platform on orbit that we've spent a long time building and we're ready to just use. And somehow we have to be able to explain to people who are not used to thinking about microgravity as a resource what they could potentially do with it as we have this beautiful space station up there for them to use. And so that's a very challenging thing because you don't know what you do. We talked earlier, you don't know, and you could go in ways you don't anticipate. So how do you tackle that?
Right. I think that is key. You don't know what you don't know, and I think there's a lot of that there still. As I mentioned earlier, there has been a lot of very important fundamental and discovery-based research that has been done, largely in the life sciences area. Again, understanding how we can survive in a microgravity environment for long periods of time. There's also been a lot of fundamental research and great discovery and very valuable research done in other areas as well. And it's not to say that there hasn't been application derived from any of these areas. There certainly has. And in fact, spin-offs are probably one of the greatest achievements that have come out of the NASA program. It's amazing how many technologies NASA developed for their own sole purposes, and as a result of that, that technology spun off into a completely different application or became eligible for use in a completely different intended market. Yet it's been really hard to kind of tell that story, and I'm not sure why, and I still don't understand why. But as we continue to focus now, what we're really trying to do is, yes, capitalize on those unintended consequences of technology spinoff or research discovery spinoff, continue to answer the fundamental questions that need to be answered to demonstrate that this is a viable platform for doing this type of work, and at the same time try to accelerate that discovery or TRL acceleration, if you will, but to try to start to do more applied research that has more of its goal in being intellectual property or products that are intended for not just Earth use, but commercial application and for just to a large degree some value, whether you consider that for profit or intangible value with respect to new knowledge, with respect to understanding diseases and how we can cure them or what have you. But that's kind of the pace that we need to accelerate towards and kind of the focus that we need to have. But that's the hardest part of how we try to communicate that to these industries that are focused on that, because we don't have a large set of data that would say if you invest this into this line of research, you're more than certain to come out with this at the end. So we need to make sure we identify the gaps and work as hard as we can to either say that there is a there or that there's not a there and move on. So
it's interesting, this conversation we've just been having. John reminds me of your number 2 rule or lesson learned that you had this morning on your slide. That was the comment about how we're not very good at seeing the future value of new tech and inventions. And I think we're seeing that played out right here with what's going on in the space industry and what's going on ISS and what could go on ISS.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's occurred to me that Duane, if you guys have a hit, if you have a pharma company, for instance, that really gets good results, that's going to make your case. Yeah, you're off and running. Absolutely. But short of that, you're really going to have to, keep selling. But you may be able to drop your marketing budget to 0 if you actually do get a hit. But yeah, I think that's right. I mean, to know what will happen, to predict the value of things that are truly new, it doesn't work that way. We could turn this back into but I don't think the American public necessarily understands that. But that is a story that's hard to tell, but I think is necessary to tell. That you know, we not only do we live off the benefits of breakthroughs in research and vast sums of money in development, but even before that, we live off breakthroughs in theory, whether it's, you know, polymer science and chemistry, or whether it's, you know, quantum mechanics, which when they were really worked out in the, you know, 19-teens and 20s and a little later in the 40s, could never be seen. I mean, there was no necessarily application for any of those things, and you know, they were mostly university related. They were not heavy funding. That kind of research obviously isn't terribly expensive. But I think, you know, to some extent still, we see those benefits. And I actually was at a quantum computing conference, and we were having a similar discussion too about trying to make that case of you know, what could this thing be? What will it do? And it's difficult, but again, I think necessary.
So I think it's probably not too far-fetched to say perhaps the next transistor phenomenon could come out of the result of research that's being done on ISS, or technology being developed to go to ISS, and we can't even see it yet.
I don't think we know. I mean, to pick a material science example, I mean, graphene is on everybody's mind too, but 10 years ago it didn't exist, and now it's the future of materials.
Let me stop here for a second. Wayne, do you have some questions for us? Or? Excellent.
We have a number of excellent questions, and I encourage the group to put some more in the queue.
Okay, so this actually is to the whole panel. So how do we get these discussions, and the beer example is cited, Gwynne, into forums like Fortune, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, the media, and this is along the lines of trying to get the public more engaged. You know, we come to conferences like this, and we talk about it amongst ourselves, and how can we spread, what are your thoughts on how we can spread this discussion into the greater public? I'll start with John.
You know, finding spokesmen who are charismatic and can carry that narrative story. I actually wrote a story about Elon and Tesla, and I mean, what can you, it's custom made for that. You know, somebody who can really talk about the future of automobiles in this case, and the capabilities and the potential, both environmental and economic of getting rid of the combustion engine. So just as an example, I do think we respond to narratives. As somebody who does that for a living, we respond to people who tell narratives, and in many ways, that's a story to be told over and over again. The last point being we respond to repetition.
Yeah, repetition I think is very important. Right. Gwynne, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a little bit along the lines of what John said. You know, this industry is very full of engineers, and engineers are generally, although the world is changing a bit, engineers are not generally the best communicators. Although the interns of today look a lot and talk a lot differently than they did when I graduated from college in '86. So I think we should talk more about what we do and talk about the successes and make sure people aren't afraid of the failures. You know, and as silly or maybe mundane as you know, going to the movie Gravity with your friends and talking about, oh, well, that wasn't quite real, but that was so cool. And, you know, really bring space and this industry to kind of the forefront of conversation. It was clearly there in the 60s and 70s, right? We were all focused. And then, I don't know, I don't know what happened. It got boring or it got repetitive, and somehow it lost the excitement, and maybe it lost the kind of the coolness factor. I do think technology is coming back as being cool. I think we have the Silicon Valley largely to thank for that, and I'd love to see more of the Silicon Valley style entrepreneurs focus on this industry, you know, we're heavy manufacturing instead of always software. So I think just like kind of grassroots, just talk to your neighbors and talk to your friends about what you do and how cool it is. And if it's not really that exciting, then maybe you should think about making it more exciting and promoting to your organizations that, you know, how could we make this more exciting? Should we do it faster? Should we be less afraid of risk and failure? You know, maybe start changing focuses within the industry itself.
You know, real quick, I want to add something to that. I think one of the issues that we're dealing with is Spaceflight has sort of been, it's woven into the fabric of our very existence. People take it for granted. There are children alive today who don't understand how unusual it is. We've had people living in space for 12 years straight on the International Space Station. That's their norm. And so I would suggest that maybe it hasn't lost its coolness factor. It's just everyone just assumes it's always going to be there. You know, so I don't know, Duane, you guys have part of your mission to try and do this sort of outreach into new communities. What sort of plans do you have?
Right. So, and I think all the points that have been made are spot on with respect to definitely need to be repetitive with the message. We definitely need to be able to tell it in a way that we haven't been able to tell it before. And yeah, I think unfortunately, I mean, I just am floored just thinking 534 people have gone into space. I mean, that's a lot, but I think that is leading to what you just suggest, that it's kind of, you know, been there, done that type of thing. So cases, we thought we were real smart when we first started. We just looked at this as very black and white and said, okay, for us to be successful, we just need to convince Congress to extend to 2028. So let's just go market to Congress. Well, that doesn't work because the only way they're going to be swayed is by their constituents actually really turning up the heat on them. So who are their constituents was kind of our next step. Well, turns out it's everybody. It's everybody, and this goes back to the Apollo program. I mean, if you think about how exciting that was, clearly the Cold War was the main driver behind that in the space race. But if you think about it, kids had lunch boxes with astronauts on them. Mm-hmm. You know, adults were buying Corvettes because the Mercury 7 drove them. I mean, it affected every demographic is my point. And so what we realized very quickly was for us to actually have any sort of an impact on our awareness and outreach of ISS, we actually need to identify how we message and how we communicate to every single one of those demographics. And if we can do that, those actually, it may go back to what our original thought was, that we are influencing the constituents who may then actually see that there is a value that they can register with. I mean, one of the problems with ISS is that you can't see it, touch it, or go there. So it's something that's really kind of hard to grasp and get your arms around. So you've got to actually be able to take those intangible concepts and make them something that can be something that a person can really say, wow, that impacts me in one way or another. And then if you can gain that traction, then hopefully that will lead to the influence. But I agree. I think we should be taking advantage of gravity hitting the box office numbers 3 weeks in a row now in the top. So, I mean, these are opportunities where, again, if we can create messages that perhaps NASA or the government can't, we are trying to capitalize on that. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think the latent interest is out there. It's a matter of leveraging our community to try and talk about it to the greatest extent possible. You know, we have this wonderful platform, this ISS on orbit, and it's at least till 2020, and we all agree, I think it needs to continue beyond that. And having that as a lever, then the next question is, what is the most important missing ingredient required to move non-governmental space from where it sits today and then into a sustainable industry in the long term? So. Do you want to try that first?
I think it's hard to narrow it down to just one, and I think that's what I've been trying to say today, particularly on this panel. I mean, we identify at least 3 issues that seem to be extremely relevant in order for us to be successful. And cost, schedule, time frame, however you want to look at it, and translating what people in the commercial industry are used to what they may have to kind of adjust to.
Yeah. Glenn, do you have anything to add?
I don't, actually. I think that's a complete answer.
Okay. Here's another one for the whole panel. Transferring NASA expertise to the private sector is a great idea, but what will happen when or if the market is facing an economic crisis? How the expertise, oh dear, and contingencies will be maintained. So I think the question is trying to hone in on, you know, we have this delicate balance of the government moving out ahead. You know, the government's doing what the government's supposed to do. It's doing the hard technology development, research and development that private industry can't do. And as we transfer that into the technical sector, how do we maintain a steady flow of that sort of information as we have this very strange economic environment around us when we get into these very tension-filled environments?